The story that we're about to read from the Torah this morning is perhaps more than any other story in the Bible directly relevant to what's going on right now in the Middle East. We read the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, these cities that were full of injustice and violence and corruption. And God decides that these evil people need to be punished. But God does something very interesting. God invites Abraham to listen to what God plans to do. And it's an important moment in the unfolding of the biblical narrative because God, in this story, is showing that human beings have a responsibility, that human beings, together with God, are in charge of maintaining the moral order in this world. And as you know, Abraham challenges God with great audacity. He says, God, I understand that these are cities that have much wickedness in them, but is it fair to punish the innocent along with the guilty? There are innocent people, there must be innocent people in these cities who are righteous, who are tzaddikim. If I can find, or if you can find, God, 50 people who are righteous, will you punish everyone and destroy the city, the innocent, along with the guilty? And God says, no, I won't. I will stay my hand. And Abraham continues to bargain with God all the way down to the number 10. So if you can find 10 righteous people, God says, because of the 10, yes, I agree. I will not wipe away the city. And of course, you know, as the story continues, it appears as though there are not even 10 righteous people in all of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the only people who are rescued are Lot, the nephew of Abraham, and his family. But that's a very strange unfolding of the narrative, because if you look at the text and the details of this story carefully, there's some difficult questions that emerge. So I want you to first of all take a look at page 102. Page 102 in our larger red books, the Eitz Chaim Chumashim, text of the Torah and commentary. And I want you to look with me on page 102, verses 20 and 21. It says, "Then the Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grave. I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note." So God is stirred by this outcry, the screaming that is coming from those cities. And the commentators ask, well, who's crying out? Those who are suffering, the poor, the oppressed. There are people suffering in that city, and that's what God is responding to. And then if you go a bit further on page 106, chapter 19, verse 13. The angels now are beseeching Lot and his family to leave. For we are, verse 13 on page 106, for we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against them before the Lord has become so great that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So there is tremendous pouring out of grief, of suffering that God hears. So where's it coming from? From those verses, it appears that there are many people, innocent people. So there were not 10. That's the difficulty with the story. We say, well, there weren't even 10 good people, but then where did this outcry come from? It comes from the oppressed, from the poor, from those who are suffering from others, from other evil, wicked people in the cities, and yet, according to the divine judgment, all are destroyed, all are punished. And I couldn't understand that, and I never really noticed it before, that detail in the text. Of course, I'm reading it now through the lens of what's happening in the world right now, and we hear the same thing. We hear that there is this tremendous outcry in Gaza, and that's true. That's absolutely true. And we ought never to minimize the suffering of the Palestinian people under the brutal regime of Hamas terrorists who have no regard for the safety and lives of their fellow Palestinians. Many civilians, many innocent civilians, yes, there are many innocent civilians who unfortunately are suffering because of what Hamas is doing, and the world understands that, and yet we hear outcries from the world now saying that Israel's response to those who are truly evil, to the butchers and barbarians who committed that massacre on October 7th, that for the sake of the innocent, the wicked should not be punished. Well, you said, well, they should be punished, but how can you punish them without harming the innocent? And that is the problem. That's the ethical challenge of this moment. And as President Herzog of Israel has said, unfortunately, this is a transformative moment for the world. This is a time when the forces of good, of morality, are pitted against immoral forces of evil and barbarism. And we have to decide, how is our world going to look in the future? And if you do not root out these people who are different from most of the civilized world, who have no regard for human life, even of their own people, then what kind of world will there be? And I also want to call to mind this morning some important words that were written recently by Professor Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis University. And he said, well, what's the goal here? What's the goal? And the world keeps asking, what's Israel's end game? What is the goal? And he says that it really ought to be stated very simply. The goal of this war is to release the hostages, punish Hamas and its enablers. And its enablers. And who are these enablers? And Professor Sarna goes on to say, to explain, that the enablers are an entire army of accomplices who stand behind Hamas. And far from being a small terrorist group dwelling among many innocent civilians, as the world and the press keep saying, Hamas actually depends upon tens of thousands of ordinary Gazans who assist it. And just as the Nazi mass murderers depended upon large numbers of local enablers, so too its counterparts in Hamas. In both cases, the enablers subsequently feigned innocence and ignorance. But that is really difficult to believe, their claims. Professor Sarna says the smuggling of food, of fuel, the smuggling of fuel, of concrete, of missiles, has depended upon enablers. How did Hamas get to be in the position that they're in now? Putting weapons amid the civilian population in or below hospitals, schools, and mosques likewise depends upon the help of enablers, including sympathetic doctors, educators, imams, construction workers. All of them either turned a blind eye to what Hamas was doing or endorsed what Hamas is doing. Family members enabled Hamas. That explains the horrific telephone call by one mass murderer who called his mother and said, "I killed 10 Jews today." Not Israelis or Zionists, but Jews, by the way. And on top of that, a great many Gazans donated funds to Hamas, and they're all part of this network of enablers that may not have known about the plans for October 7th, but they assuredly knew that this group, Hamas, planned to murder as many innocent Jewish civilians as it could someday, because that's what Hamas promised to do in its charter. It's what Gazans expected Hamas to do whenever they were able. And so when we say, we paint this picture of, a few hundred Hamas terrorists, the real savages among the leadership in Gaza, and then 2 million innocent people, it's not an accurate picture. And again, I want to emphasize, there are, I don't mean to paint every person in Gaza as an enabler. There are many, many, many good, normal, peace-loving, civilian Palestinian people there. And Israel is doing its best to try to warn those people, move away from this area. This is going to be a battlefield. Move here, don't go, dropping leaflets, warning every way that they can. And we know now that Hamas is preventing Palestinians from even, those who want to heed the warnings, can't even move because of what Hamas is doing. The use now of ambulances as transport vehicles for terrorist murderers. Israel recently, as you know, targeted a particular ambulance that their intelligence showed was carrying not wounded civilians, not wounded Palestinians, but terrorists. And the world is outraged. This is the battle that we are engaged in. And there will be casualties, and there will be innocents who are swept away. But sometimes, for the good of humanity, innocence must be part of the casualties. And we try as best as we can to minimize the number of those innocent deaths. But when you hear astronomical figures in the thousands of innocent people who perished in certain strikes, first of all, those figures we know, because they are reported by the terrorists themselves who run the Gaza Health Ministry, that they are absolutely inflated. But that's not to say that there aren't thousands who are perishing. But how else can you wage this war? The only other answer is to say, okay, those who call for a ceasefire and say, stop it, stop the bombing for humanitarian purposes. So you are being very kind to the innocent, but what you're doing is you're allowing the absolutely wicked and evil to endure and ensure that in the future they will wreak their evil and their savage brutality and their murderous actions, not only upon people in Israel and Jews, but upon others in the world as well. If you say that this type of evil can stand and endure, then you are dooming the future of the world. And I think that that's what emerges in this very difficult, troubling, ethically challenging story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that we read this morning, that the cry came out to God, and yet we know many of those who must have cried out to God must have also perished in this destruction of the cities, because God decided, even though I have mercy for those who are innocent, I also want this world to be a place of goodness and morality, and this is the only path forward. So Abraham taught God, and God taught Abraham, and together as Jews, as a global community of conscience and morality, we hope that when this war ends, the evil will be destroyed and the righteous will be left to rejoice. And we will, of course, mourn the inevitable loss of those good people who were truly victims in this just cause. You can follow the reading this morning